Good day, gentlemen. I want to first say a few words about this particularly glorious day. As most of you probably know, today is a very important day, for today is International Women's Day, a day that was created or founded by one Clara Zetkin, a German communist from the late 19th to early 20th century, who instantiated this day in about 1910 at a conference between women. And I think the only thing we can do is to be appropriate and offer some words of encouragement. So I'd just like to say, glory be to womankind. Thank you, womankind, for existing and doing stuff just like the rest of us. Amen. Having got that out of the way, I want to talk about the reason why so many people are so turned off to the quote-unquote black pill, or the ideas contained within the black pill, not just as they pertain to looks, but in general, broadly. Because I think it all follows a certain pattern. And we're going to unwrap that and talk about some of these reasons. The first reason why people generally reject the black pill and fear its contents is their inability and unwillingness to acknowledge it. Now, a lot of this boils down to the inability to acknowledge our animal nature. Humans are undeniably animals. We are animals. We're not the same as rats or cockroaches, or even the same as chimpanzees, but we are animals nonetheless. And to borrow some refined terminology from the esteemed Lord of Ireland, aka the Scion of Dagda, I would say it comes down to people's innate fear of their ooga booga nature. The ooga booga is always present with us, and people struggle to acknowledge it because for untold decades now, we find ourselves behind the veil of modernity. Modernity, or post-modernity, or however you want to refer to it, through technology, through architecture, through the entirety of the atmosphere and environment is created, has served to mask our innate deep connection to ooga booga. And people, to be perfectly frank, are terrified of ooga booga. Why are people afraid of ooga booga? Why are people afraid of their innate animalistic nature? It's pretty simple. People think they're better than that. People do not think of themselves as animals. And I've always thought this is strange. Sure, it's entirely possible to mask the ooga booga in terms of sociality, psychology, the way we interact with each other. But every time, whether you're a male or female, you feel the need to take a dump, and that slick, disgusting brown substance comes streaming forth from your butt cheeks, that is a definitive proof of ooga booga, is it not? We all have to take dumps, we all have to piss and eat and do all these things. We are animals, and the very fact that for years pig's insulin was used to help treat human diabetics, we're animals, right? But yes, people feel very uncomfortable acknowledging that they are possessed of certain animalistic instincts and animalistic nature, etc., etc. And people go so far as to say things such as, if you tell them you're just an animal, I'm just an animal, they'll say, maybe you're an animal, but I'm not an animal. The element of the black pill specifically that reminds people that they're animals is, for example, our obsession with looks, that we simply react to people who are good looking in a better way, aka the halo effect. The halo effect is very potent, and again, to borrow terminology from the esteemed, wise, and learned Lord of Ireland, aka the Scion of Dagda, the phalo effect. This is his term, the phalo effect. I am borrowing it, so I am attributing it to Lord Pete, Baron of Brooklyn. The phalo effect, when you are very unattractive and what people think of you, or very short as a man, etc., etc. So this too, in addition to our amazing ability to take dumps, is a byproduct of ooga booga. It's not to say other things aren't important, but even those things are part of ooga booga. Whether or not you have certain preferences in terms of personality, or your appreciation of certain smells versus other smells. All of this comes down to the ooga booga. And one thing that the black pill does, I think, rather effectively, is it brings home the lesson that, again, we are just animals, and no one is an exception to this. We are all the end product of an incredibly long chain of ancestors who were subjected to various evolutionary and sexual selection pressures that led to us. We are the result, and we are not fundamentally different from them, and this is just something we need to accept. And of course, normies won't accept that, But this is a major reason why there's so much resistance to the black pill, in addition to one of the reasons why so many people are resistant to applying evolutionary theory to human beings, even though we are smack in the middle of it and we are animals like all the other animals on Earth. And again, we're byproducts of the same processes that help shape us. But that's one reason. Another reason is somewhat more complex, and that is the fact that you have various academics who talk about subject matters related to the black pill indirectly: evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology, and the various selection pressures that go into male and female psychology, this sort of thing. And they're willing to talk about things that your average normie isn't. Now, again, I'm using normie in the sense of mentality. But they're not willing to acknowledge some of the downsides to all of this. They're not willing to acknowledge the bleaker side of the science, which I think inevitably leads to a somewhat black pill perspective. And I'll remind you that most of the people that talk about this in academia are typically older, they're well established. They certainly didn't have to face the hurdles of your average guy in this day and age, and certainly not somebody who is a sub-5, just as an example. And so the academics, who for the most part have created a lot of the lexicon and terminology for this field and have handed down information to us, people like David Buss, Jeffrey Miller, on the one hand, they meet a lot of resistance in academic circles, but on the other hand, they're unwilling to go the extra mile. And so, for example, in a book such as Jeffrey Miller's What Women Want, that he co-authored with a guy by the name of Tucker Max, it's a very, very gynocentric book. I've never read it. I've skimmed through it. And it really is just an admonition to men. It's basically telling men how bad they are about things and how they need to improve. And so even within the context of evolutionary psychology, and I have to be honest, Jeffrey Miller in this context is a kind of luminary, they're very resistant to get to brass tacks about this stuff because on the one hand, they're afraid of the consequences of being censored, of being sidelined, and it makes sense because for aforementioned reasons, there's a lot of resistance to these ideas, and they just don't want to be put into that situation, so they're not going to really talk about it. Another important reason is pretty simple. The black pill isn't profitable, especially if you're into guru coaching, dating, etc., etc. So we'll take, again, Bathrobe Man as an example. Bathrobe Man is somebody who's grown quite quickly, but you think he would have grown to the same extent if he were peddling quote-unquote black pills instead of red pills. If he were not making offers of salvation to the benighted masses, I think that's very unlikely. So if we're honest, the black pill, in addition to the reasons I've already cited, the first reason, the Ooga Booga reason probably being the primary one, it just doesn't sell very well. And depending on how you deal with it, is not necessarily what I would call a message of hope. I think there are things you can do, and there are ways you can move and be mobile within the context of the black pill, but it's not necessarily the most optimistic, hopeful message, going back to the Ooga Booga, about humanity. It's much better to sell people a story about how all you really need to do once you've grasped the basics is to self-improve and do X, Y, and Z, and that's this current version of the red pill. Who knows what these things mean, because they always change all the time. My understanding of the red pill today is just that, and it's just not profitable. It's not profitable to dating coaches. It's not profitable to life coaches. It's not profitable to people who tell you that there are all these things you can do to improve your life, when in reality there might be a few things, but even improving these things may or may not make a difference depending on the way you look, depending on how tall you are, depending on how smart you are, because, again, the black pill certainly is not a message of hope. It's a message of realism, and increasingly the way the red pill is quote-unquote marketed, it's much more a message of ethereal hope, partly bounded by reality, but partly bounded by wishful thinking, and wishful thinking always sells better and feels better than the opposite of wishful thinking. Now, obviously, all these reasons are interconnected and linked to each other. I think the most obvious one, which is why I spent the most time on it, is the Ooga Booga, our animalistic nature, and the fact that people are just very, very unwilling to acknowledge that, because acknowledging it would be tantamount to saying, I am just an animal. And indeed, we are just animals, a different sort of animal from other animals, but nonetheless animals. And very few people can come to terms with that, seemingly people who are normies, people with normative psychology, because it seems to produce negative effects in their minds and psychology. As always, thank you for tuning in. Please leave a like, share, comment, subscribe. A shout out to the Lord of Ireland, aka the Scion of Dagda, for his amazing terminology, specifically the Phalo effect. That's legendary. And if I'm still alive, I will check you out later. Everyone enjoy the rest of your week. May the gods watch over you, especially Dagda. Take care.